Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. This this event was put on by RAMA, which stands for Radical Action with Migrants in Agriculture, or Red de Apoyo para Migrantes Agrícolas in Spanish. Me and Robin have began organizing this kind of this side venture from RAMA called Grassroots for Grassroots last year with the support of BCGU, which is the public sector union here in BC. What we noticed was a huge gap in trainings and workshops in the interior, especially in rural areas where we organize. Vernon, Armstrong, Kelowna, West Kelowna, down to the South Okanagan in British Columbia. So we decided that we would put something on, and actually Dia's family welcomed us into their home last year, and that was the first series of events that we did, which we were very happy with. So during this COVID time, we decided we would still kind of try to keep that ball rolling, and I'm very happy to have our three panelists, Don Morrison, who is from the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Working Group, as well as the Indigenous Food and Freedom School. Kamau Kate Franklin from Community Movement Builders in Atlanta, and Edgar Franks from Familias Unidas por la Justicia, operating out of Washington State, just below us. So thank you so much. There's a huge array of knowledge here as far as community building. I've been following, each of yours work in admiration for quite some time, and I know that the work that you guys have been doing is really, grassroots from the bottom and building up the communities that you live in. So I'm gonna pass it on. Before that, we're gonna do 15 to 20 minutes of each panelist, and then we'll move into a discussion moderated by Dia from the Kinfolk Collective, as well as Robin Bunn from RAMA. Thank you so much.
Who would you like to start? Any, mini, miny, mo.
I don't mind starting just to get it going. Again, my name is Kamau Franklin. I am the founder of an organization called Community Movement Builders. We actually have 6 chapters: Atlanta, New Orleans, Dallas, Memphis, Tennessee, San Diego, and I always forget one. And I'll remember that as we go on, which one it is that I forgot. But we have 6 chapters around the country. We're a grassroots organizing outfit. I would say our work fits into 2 distinct roles, or 2 models. I would say one is grassroots organizing. So we organize particularly here in the Atlanta region around gentrification and around the issue of police brutality and misconduct / terrorism in our communities. We're an all-Black organization. Our mission is around the self-determination of Black communities within the United States. And then we also do what we call sustainable development. And for us, sustainable development is finding alternatives to capitalist development. So creating cooperative models of economic development that we can spread throughout our community and have those grow to a point where they're actually sort of making resources that we can regenerate and use within the community. So some of the cooperatives that we have going is a aquaponics cooperative, a sea moss cooperative, soon to be a kale chip cooperative, and a security cooperative. And I should mention, as part of our security cooperative, we actually do cop watches and security patrols, safety patrols in the local community that we work in. So we work in a grassroots, I guess, in some nonprofit jargon, we'd be considered sort of a place-based model, right? So we work in the very community that some of us live in. We have a community house, particularly in our Detroit, and Detroit might have been the chapter I left out actually, in our Detroit and our Atlanta chapters. We have community houses that we do our organizing out of. And we also have community gardens. And so for us, being a multi-issue organization is key because we don't think our community suffers just from one particular issue. Our community suffers from many different things, and all of that stems, in our opinion, in our political analysis, from capitalism and white supremacy. So for us, the key to battling those things is creating Indigenous community-based organizations that can grow into not only national work, but international work. And I should also say that we do Pan-African work in Haiti, where we have a sister organization that we're also helping to support to develop a community model of organizing in Haiti. So for us, it all those pieces fits together. We consider ourselves as an organization that grows out of the Black liberation movement in terms of the historical struggle of our folks in the United States to be liberated again from sort of a white supremacist nation state. So we consider ourselves to be in that lineage, in a lineage of folks that we work with, that we've learned from, including people from the Black Panther Party and other organizations and formations from the 60s and 70s, that those are the politics that we carry forward. We do some electoral work, but we consider electoral work to be something that should be an outgrowth of organization is adopt enough to sort of either support or to have somebody who comes out of our organizing practice to run for local offices, then that's when we would decide to sort of support an electoral candidate. In the meantime, what we really do is sort of beat them over the head to try to make them do a little bit of right, but not expecting too much out of their sort of organizing, let's say out of the sort of the apparatus in which they themselves participate in, which is sort of a neoliberal state apparatus that we don't think provides sort of a liberation, obviously doesn't provide anything towards sort of a liberation model for our folks. And so lastly, I'll say, since this is sort of an international forum, that obviously with the election coming up within the United States between Trump and Biden, we take a particular political view that we, obviously we think Trump is the sort of forward-leading edge to what can be considered sort of a new age fascism within the United States, a prototype fascism. But we think, in particular, Biden represents a status quo outlook. And so then again, it means nothing towards changing how the empire operates, either internally within the United States for working class people, Black folks and other folks of color, or internationally when it comes to US hegemony around the world and sort of European domination of resources and land around the world. So we don't see any real choices in the election that really makes that grand of a difference in terms of where we are as a people fighting for our own liberation. So we are very, so we try to make sure that folks understand that. It doesn't mean we don't think that voting matters in some contexts, but within the larger idea of a liberation politics, you're not going to vote yourself out of a system that oppresses you. That's only going to come from organizing on various fronts to create an organizational apparatus that has the power to move not only the people at large, but to move people in power from doing things to you. And so that you can start doing things for yourself. And that includes creating alternative institutions, and as well as taking over institutions that currently exist and destroying those institutions that we feel continue to oppress us. So I'll leave it at that as a starting point.
My apologies, I was muted. Thank you very, very much. Next, Dawn, would you like to say something?
Yes, thank you. Really good to hear from Kamau and get to learn about your work, Kamau. And I'm excited to hear all the panelists speak about everybody's work. And thank you for inviting me to share a little bit about ours. since 2006, I've been working as the founder and curator of research and relationships, a coordinator, chairperson, wearing many different hats to build an Indigenous food sovereignty movement here in so-called Canada. And the Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty is the body that I've brought together over the last 15 years in a very flexible and fluid structure with people who have come over the years, Indigenous and people of all colors who have come to help us think through the issues, the concerns, the situations, and the strategies of why Indigenous peoples are not able to respond to our own needs for food in the similar way that our ancestors did for thousands of years prior to colonization. And so in that work, we've learned a lot about the resiliency and all the things to appreciate and build on in terms of how our ancestors were able to live the reality of food sovereignty for all those years. In so-called BC, the colonial system is actually still very much a baby in our eyes. BC became a colony under the Dominion of Canada 150 years ago only. My ancestry is of Secwepemc heritage. I also have mixed heritage. My father is Scottish, Irish and Scottish, hence the last name Morrison. But I identify most strongly with my mother's heritage, who is full-blood Secwepemc. And as the eldest survivor of the intergenerational impacts of Indian residential school, where my mother was forced to live from the time she was 5 years old till the time she was 13, and then had me at 15. I was very much born with a memory of the systems of oppression and the racism, the white supremacy, and the ways that they stole the land, the children, the health and well-being, the beautiful, rich food economy, the narrative of our subsistence economy, our subsistence hunting, fishing, and gathering that we still persist in to this day. So my work over the years, through talking with literally thousands of Indigenous people across so-called Canada, we started out mostly organizing in BC, and but it's since extended out to a lot of what can be considered traditional trade networks, Indigenous and people of color from other continents. We have long-standing trade relationships, even prior to contact, prior to modern technology. We had ways of transport, of traveling, and we had ways of communicating, and that were, informed some of those relationships and prophecies that we've learned of in talking with many Indigenous peoples. So our organizing framework has been really looking at a decolonizing approach to not only the research and the relationships, but also to the way we know and the way we've come to know what we know. We've learned over the years that even in researching traditional trade networks and what those used to look like prior to contact, what our economies used to look like, and realizing how much we're still actually persisting in that, and the potential to do more, especially in the times of COVID and the economic fallout of the climate crisis and capitalism and all of the, the systemic, these are some of the hugest systemic challenges that humans have ever had to face. And we know that our our long-standing, our knowledge, our ways of knowing, and through the living reality, through our languages, through our culture, through our relationships to the land and the people and the plants and one another, and the animals that, such as wild salmon and some of the ungulate species. It is very powerful to think of what they teach us and the crises that we're in right now. Many Indigenous communities have declared a state of emergency in terms of food insecurity and lack of access to our traditional foods. Some nations have put a moratorium on moose hunting. Wild salmon have dwindled to literally hundreds and were once literally millions, teeming red, spawning, millions of bodies spawning in some of the, in the river, 5 major river systems in the province. And so, you know, when we look at how we've adopted agriculture to supplement our diets, because we have no longer have the access that we used to, we're looking at, you know, the kind of mobilizing the knowledge and networks and how Indigenous food sovereignty and social justice can inform the reconceptualizing of a framework for a new narrative in food systems discourse that transcends beyond the agrarian, the cultural hierarchy that was imposed 150 years ago on par with British morality, that viewed agrarians as superior to us heathen hunters, fishers, and gatherers. And yet we are the oldest living memory of what it means to live sustainably in this place, in a giving and sharing and trading economy, and what it means to learn to live with less and to manage for abundance rather than for scarcity and for resource extraction and the taking and the imbalanced way of taking and without giving back. So we know that there's a lot of potential in the Indigenous ways of being and knowing, that we still have not lost. It's still within us. Probably if you compare even the West Coast to, you know, to the Indigenous peoples on the East Coast of so-called Canada, we know that many in the East were colonized about 350 to 400 years earlier than us, as was the case in many other, well, the parts of the US and different parts of the world. So I, you know, I feel like organizing here and mobilizing the knowledge and networks with, you know, the ways that we still hold it within our ancestral memories to know how we can actually reconceptualize something and to remember what it means to be on this planet in a better way. And so I'm really interested in getting to know all of you more and to learn about how we can come together with Black and Indigenous and people of color from all over, because I know we share a common narrative about the systematic oppression and the need to change the narrative is really important, because we cannot reconcile within the same system and narrative that was designed to dispossess us. It's crazy making, and I just I can't say that enough. And it is going to take a large kind of uprising from the bottom up. Mind you, there are even different levels of government that are coming to us to say, yeah, it's time to do this. What that really looks like in policy and planning, changing planning frameworks and really trying to work in a Western science techno-bureaucratic way remains to be seen. But I know there is a lot of potential on the ground for people to transition to a regenerative food system that's life-giving and holistic and health and cooperative, and some of the things that Kamau had already mentioned. So I'm not quite sure. I apologize. I didn't read the email to see how long I was supposed to talk for in the beginning, but I don't know if I'll have an opportunity later, but I don't want to hog all the time either. So I'll leave it at that for now, and trust that there'll be time for more to come out later if there's any questions. Or
Thank you so much. And indeed, there will be time. And you are fine, not over time. Thank you, Dawn.
okay, thank you.
Yes. Edgar, please.
Thank you. And it's good to be here with everyone. I've always been an admirer of the work that RAMA has been doing, and a lot of the solidarity work that they've been doing. I remember a couple years ago, we were just in Bellingham, and out of the blue, Luis showed up off of a trip. I think he was taking down the west coast of the U.S., and he made a stop in Bellingham, Washington, and and he was interested, and he was asking about how his organization or himself could support a boycott that we were doing at that time. Ever since then, I really admired that show of solidarity from somebody that didn't know us or anything like that, just to show up out of the blue and just offer that contribution to support workers that he also had never met. But we always appreciate that, and we always remember that. So thank you to Luis and Rama. It's good to be here with Kamau and Don. Thank you, Rama, for organizing this and inviting us on. So my name is Edgar. I'm the political director for an independent farm worker union here in the state of Washington. We're based in Burlington, which is a couple miles away from the northern border with Canada. So our union was formed in 2013. It's made up of, our members are over 500 indigenous Mexican people, Mixteco and Triqui people from Guerrero and Oaxaca, that labor in the fields in Whatcom and Skagit County, from where we're at. So they're the first union that has been formed for farm workers in over almost 40 years in the United States. They were, one of the unique things I think also is that they were formed at a time, I think, where a lot of changes were happening in Washington State. At that time, the first socialist candidate was running in the Seattle City Council, Shama Sawant. The fight for 15 was happening, for $15 an hour for minimum wage workers. The big immigrant rights movement that was happening. And then also the rise of Donald Trump, or whatever way you want to call it. It became really hostile an environment to organize farm workers during this time. ICE roundups, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement was in full force. Many people, we were taking on at that time what was going to be what is the largest corporation to distribute fruits and berries, which is called Driscoll's. And there was this group of 400, 500 indigenous people that barely spoke any Spanish, didn't speak English at all. Lots of the folks were undocumented, and taking on a big corporation and one of the largest farms in Washington State to produce berries. despite, you know, a lot of people and professional organizers telling them that the odds were too big, that even forming a union, it was not gonna happen because of the ways labor laws have been structured in the United States. You know, to really exclude and make it hard for field workers to organize themselves into unions, being excluded from labor laws and environmental protections and all that. And then you know, compounded with bad immigration policies, militarized local police, racists and fascist people. Like, you'd be holding a picket line and you get like threatened, like right across the street. So it became like this hostile environment. But despite all that, and for almost 4 years of going on strike, protesting, picketing, going all around the U.S. and to Mexico, the workers were finally able to win a contract. In 2016, they were officially recognized and were able to vote in their company for the unionizing. They almost 80% of the workers voted in favor of the union. Negotiated their own contract with, you know, with company lawyer against company lawyers and professionals, and were able to establish one of the best farm worker contracts for farm workers, in our opinion, in the whole United States. We just renewed it this May, so it's something that we're working on, you know. And just to highlight some of the new things that we were able to win, we were able to win a health plan for workers. We were able to win childcare, and also wages that exceed the minimum wage in Washington State. So, you know, it's been pretty good. However, you know, looking back at it and just some of the lessons that we've learned throughout this whole process is, you know, that organizing workers, if we want to really, I mean, from our perspective, and it's really similar to what Don was talking about within the food system and how dominant the agriculture industry is in not only the way that food is produced, but just how it determines a lot of what we do in our lives, really has an impact. And from our perspective, poverty, the extraction of labor and resources coming from an industrial agricultural system that has always been unjust in the United States, since the founding of the United States, when they exploited African labor. That same system, that plantation system, is still in place, only at a much more industrialized, globalized level. We've seen that from our perspective, the workers are on the bottom rung of the power structure in agriculture. And if we really want to transform the system, workers have to play a big part in that. By withholding labor, by confronting big corporations, by also proposing changes to the system, and really bringing that experience. I think a lot of people in the United States forget that farm workers are actually sustenance farmers that have farmed and done agriculture for thousands and thousands of years, whether it be in their home country, you know, and have this traditional knowledge within them. But because of, you know, bad policy, bad corruption, and everything that goes into a neoliberal system and how it's transformed, in our case, Mexico, has displaced farmers and local farmers and made them into the only way they can sustain themselves is to sell off their land and migrate and sell their labor to these corporations. I think people along that process, especially when you cross into the United States, forget that farm workers actually have a lot of knowledge and know how to transform a system that is designed to exploit. Workers know how to, since they're the ones that are exploited, also know the good things of agriculture. The only thing that's missing is that opportunity. And it's been our experience that in order to really practice your ideas, you have to fight for it. One step for us is to fight for these unionizing contracts, these union contracts, to give us some breathing room, and to provide for families and for our people, and have good food and dignity in your workplace. Also a place where you can democratically start practicing democracy. You know, a lot of we're just talking about, we're talking about the elections. You know, farm workers, for the most part, are undocumented. They're not going to be able to vote for anybody, but they can, through unionizing, practice that kind of democracy within their workplace, which is one of the few places where their vote will count. So these processes and unionizing ultimately, I think, leads us to conclude that union organizing and winning rights at your work is part of that process of transitioning away from a bad agricultural system into something that is more equitable and just and sustainable. So at least in our union, we've been talking and thinking, trying to think this through, of what it really would mean for immigrants and farm workers to win their own liberation. And also what Kamau was mentioning about the cooperatives and, you know, local solidarity economy. That's what I think really is our next step for our union. Knowing that union contracts can get us only so far. You know, companies can move and close, or, you know, we could lose a vote. I mean, that's always a reality. But if we start organizing ourselves to use unionizing and the benefits that it comes with it into positioning ourselves to transform a system and an economy that has been built to exploit us, I think that's kind of the interesting part of our work that we're kind of gearing up for. So I think currently right now, I think we're seeing that even in this coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen that the economy is not really geared for protecting human life. I mean, the United States, you know, it's really good at having big armies, you know, all these like militaristic things, but in reality, the country stopped because, you know, there was not even enough masks, ventilators, or hospital beds to go around, and there still isn't. But, you know, we have this huge army, but when it comes down to the needs of people, the United States isn't prepared. You know, so I think this crisis really puts in perspective a lot of things about how we do actually need a better food system. We need to really figure out that democracy, what real democracy looks like, I think, is a big lesson into all this. And organizing and mutual aid and solidarity is key for our own survival in our communities. So yeah, those are just some of my thoughts from our union, from here in Washington State. Right now we're in Yakima, trying to start a new union, also warehouse workers. So yeah, so great to be here.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Now we're going to go to our participants and the folks who are watching us live on Facebook for any questions. So send us your questions, everyone. You can put them in the Facebook Live comments, or you can put them in the Q&A here. and we'll be reading those to the panelists. If you really, really, really would like to ask the question yourself, please use the raise the hand feature and we'll figure out how to turn your microphone on so you can do that. Okay, over to Dia.
Sorry. Thank you so much. My mind is buzzing hearing all of you wonderful, influential people speak. As a young person listening, the possibilities are endless on what can be done. And the work that you guys are doing is so inspirational to me. So I have a couple questions here. Just going back to you, Edgar, briefly, you were talking about mutual aid and solidarity and what real liberation looks like for farm workers. Here in Kelowna, migrant workers, farm workers, they're very separate. They're very isolated from the community. So it's very hard to really, and thanks to RAMA, that's how even the general community and public knows about what they're going through. Is that the same case out in Washington, so-called Washington? And is that the case where farm workers are isolated? And how is that work in coalescing the general community and farm workers in liberating themselves without relying on the corporations?
Yeah, it is the case. I think that there's kind of I'll try to be quick about this. There's an H-2A program, which is similar to the seasonal agricultural workers that exist in Canada. They're called guest workers here under the H-2A visa program, which are basically when workers sign these contracts, they give their life away to a farmer. We call it, it's almost close to human trafficking about what happens. If it wasn't for a lot of community organizations such as RAMA and where I used to work at, it was community, a lot of the injustices that happen out in the farms would never be heard of or documented. I think in the United States context, the farm workers, a lot of people think that everything is good because we had Cesar Chavez and he came along and fixed everything all of a sudden, and we have no more problems since the 70s. But a lot of the gains that were made by the UFW and Cesar Chavez have been rolled back, and that's the position that we find ourselves in right now, and maybe even worse. And I think that also opens up an opportunity for a new generation of organizers that can meet the demands of this current political moment.
Don't mute yourself yet. I got a couple questions for you. Thank you. So when you were talking, I was thinking about what does that solidarity look like then? Because Indigenous people also are in the so-called United States, and also farm workers. They both deserve that right and protection to abundant life. And even though there's different struggles, I know that there was talk of farm workers maybe in terms of liberation having their own land and setting up communities and stuff like that. I'm always interested in how does that work without furthering the displacement of Indigenous people. Now, also, I'm not quite familiar with the case in the US in terms of, because again, as Dawn said earlier, BC and Canada is 150 years. So we have a different colonial history than the US. Is there a way, has that been thought of, or what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think that's a good question, because as immigrants here in the United States, I think we're familiar, and that process of displacement and colonialism and that mindset. We come from it too. I think again through that process of of becoming, having your own land in your own country, and then displacing, and then having to sell your labor, and that whole.
Uh-oh. Edgar, you are frozen.
Hello. Did it drop off?
It dropped off.
Okay.
Just start over.
Okay. I was just gonna say, through that process, we do forget a lot about the displacement among ourselves, and we have to be really careful we don't fall into that pattern. I think it's, if I get it right, I think it's called settler colonialism, that we don't fall into that while we're on somebody else's land. And it's something that we try to work on daily. Even if we talk about this issue of acquiring land, how do we do that in a manner that isn't disrespectful, and we don't just replicate, European farmers that just come in and take over everything. And I think that's where the solidarity comes from, and that practice of, being with people. Like in our area, there's, the Lummi Nation is right there, and they've been going through their struggles against coal and big petroleum companies. So the way that we want to have that relationship is through showing up through solidarity, and, in a respectful way, in a good way, and not just imposing ourselves and say like, hey, we're here and we're just gonna just take over everything. That's not, I don't think that's the way that we want to continue.
Thank you so much. I see that there's a question. I have so many questions, so I'll pause myself here. I see that there's a question from Laura Prada. She says, to all panelists, what is one thing you've learned about self-care during the pandemic while you do this work? Dawn, you can start if you'd like.
Okay, thank you. That's a really important questions. They're all important, and it's with that, I guess, thinking about organizing from the inside out. We're living obviously in very uncertain times, and many Indigenous elders have taught me and taught us that if part of what it means to be Indigenous is to work with nature. Nature has its own capacity to regenerate and heal. It is the healing. It is the ultimate life force that enables our body to regenerate, to heal, to help us to breathe, our lungs to breathe, and our heart to beat involuntarily. It makes a seed sprout involuntarily, and it's quite amazing how we can take care of ourselves and how we can heal even in times of a crisis. And sometimes it's if we've been privileged enough to be given certain teachings and tools, and for those of us who, well, myself and many in my family and my community who have overcome enough of adversity to be able to kind of put some of those teachings and tools into practice in terms of self-care, in terms of building a community of regenerative practice and decolonizing our practice and doing this work in a way that we're supporting each other in working in a regenerative way instead of a productionist way. So again, the production paradigm was instituted in the Industrial Revolution as a way to intensify production, and it's reached the limits of its growth. It's also what's built this colonial empire. It's the underlying mindset that's built this corporate empire, colonial empire, however you want to name it. One and the same as far as I'm concerned. But So transitioning out of that production paradigm, you know, we're not machines. That paradigm is based on a Cartesian worldview. It's a very mechanistic worldview. The sustenance agriculture that Edgar referred to, the subsistence economies of hunting, fishing, farming, and gathering, Indigenous peoples all over the world. That's not our narrative. That's not our paradigm. So again, it's that self-care is going back to changing, you know, decolonizing our mind. And there's an amazing Indigenous scholar, Dr. Michael Yellowbird, who's done his research on decolonizing the mind, and he's mapped out, done neuroscience of the brain and looked at the effects of Indigenous, like, contemplative traditions, like ceremony and meditation and land-based pedagogy, land-based healing, and how that gives us the strength and resiliency, you know, that ability to work with nature is the self-care. And, you know, I think also organizing in itself can be self-care if we're approaching it with the right mindset. And I've had to learn this the hard way, because I've, you know, I'm in my own process of decolonizing, and I realize how, you know, as a single mother, a woman who's overcome addictions, sexual violence, patriarchy, and poverty, and all of the things that I've had to overcome. To me, activism is my therapy. It's the alternative is, you know, what, sadly, what many people choose. And what I was choosing for a while was the drugs and alcohol and the lifestyle, the hopelessness. But to fight back, I think, is a form of self-care if it's done right with the right mindset. And I can get very inspired by the work, and forget that it's a challenge, or I can also feel really drained by it. And so that's a really important question for us to be really looking at, decolonizing our paradigms and our concepts of time and the way we're pushing ourselves in this work, because a lot can be accomplished by working with the higher power, and really attuning to that within our own bodies, within nature. And we are that, and be that. And so, yeah, I could probably say a lot more about it and go talk the whole time about it, but that's kind of the basic premise of how I see that.
Thank you so much. I love that. Decolonizing the concept of time and how we work. That's dope. That's dope, because sometimes we just we have to get this now, and we're running on this European, Eurocentric time frame of 24 hours, you know? So thank you. Kamau, I'd just like to take that to you, the same question on how, what is one thing you've learned about self-care during the pandemic while you do this work?
That I need it. I probably too have been one of those organizers who have run at full blast, and is in some ways always gotten both the tension and the healing of organizing is sort of part of the life's work, and my version of sort of self-care. But as an older organizer now, who's they're not able to sort of run the streets like I used to. I'm married, I have 2 kids who are relatively young. And even though community movement builders is something that I founded and have helped develop, I've learned that sort of pacing myself, particularly during this epidemic, is something that's needed. And that also involves sort of the trust of a lot of the younger organizers, having to trust in them to the same trust that other organizers had in me at one point when I was young, was to get it right or wrong, to fall and get up and try again, to offer some, whatever it's worth, some sage advice from an older organizer, but to let some other folks sort of run the ship who are in a position to do it and to have confidence in their work, and again, in their ability to get it both right and wrong and to learn from the mistakes. I would also say that, you know, part of our organizing as a group, as soon as COVID hit, we sort of switched gears because most of our work stopped. And then we sort of switched gears and started also providing community support, mutual aid to folks. And that became the work that we started doing for a while. And as folks know, in New York, a lot of the police brutality incidents, recent spat of police murders that got a lot of attention started hitting during the COVID. And that caused a lot of us to, whether we liked it or not, to come back out of our homes and to get back into the streets and to start thinking about that work and how we do that work again, and you know, how we do it in a safe way for those who are working with and for ourselves, but how we also felt the need to get back out there because self-care was needed for not just us as individuals, but for our entire community, right? That's self-care can be an individual act, but it can also be sort of a communal way of thinking about the work that we do and give. And our community, even through crisis, still needs support, still needs resources. We're not in a position, resource-wise, to hunker down and not have some expectations because of the exploitive nature of the system we live under, which doesn't care about poor people, doesn't care about working class people, and the assistance that's needed from groups like ours, and our ability to, and in some ways, to say that these are political moments that are happening, and we have to be out there and let folks know that, you know, these aren't just incidents that are happening because of something poorly run. These are things that are happening because something that's running the way it was intended to, which was to dispose of poor and working class people, particularly Black folks and other folks of color. And so that becomes a part of the work and what we have to do in terms of that sort of larger communal self-care that needs to take place within our community.
Thank you so much. And it's so true. You know, you talked about children, and it's a different ballgame when you got kids, you know? So yeah, but thank you for talking about, you even touched on briefly on how to organize and change. Edgar, please just respond to that question of what is one thing you've learned about self-care during the pandemic while you do this work? And thank you, Kamau.
Well, something I learned about self-care. Well, I think one of the things that really helped me in the first couple of weeks was just going out and planting a garden. Like I tore up like a big part of my mom's backyard and started to garden. And then I just figured out how hard it really was to garden, like, and how patient you have to be. So I think that in the beginning was one of the ways. I think to a little bit what Don was mentioning about getting back to nature. I think that was, I mean, that was my attempt to kind of like rediscover that part of myself that had been buried for many, many years. You know, we've been working in the fields for a big part of my life. And then I grew up to hate farming and agriculture because of how bad and crappy it was, the treatment. But now, like, getting back and seeing, you know, a little bit, you know, the beginning when I planted corn and sunflowers, and seeing the first sprouts come out and just how happy I was. And I was like, oh, I can do this. I think that really got me really, you know, made me feel better. And I mean, that was a really good thing. And now I've been in this hotel room for like almost 5 months since May in Yakima while we're organizing. So right now, my way to kind of do self-care is just being by myself, I guess, and just reflecting on a lot of things, on my family and on the work that we do and how we do the things. I think that's been a big help in this whole time of the coronavirus. I actually got sick here while I was in Yakima. I got coronavirus So it also made me reflect on a lot of things, and kind of like a big perspective on how to take care of myself better, and enjoy being with friends and family and gardening.
Thank you so much for the work you are doing, and we're glad that you're in good health. So we have another question. It says, due to COVID-19, our usual in-person organizing strategies have been curtailed. How have you adapted your work, or what are some creative ways of organizing during a pandemic? I'll just open it up to anyone.
I'd like to respond to that. Hello? Okay.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so during the pandemic, the organizing, I found it to be probably, like many people, very challenging. Just the not being able to be as in closer contact with people. I think we all want to be with people, and being in isolation is hard. And it being online, I found it really challenging with the internet, just the energy of so much time on the internet, often from 9 a.m. to 10, 11 at night every night it's been really challenging. But where I've been able to get balance with that is it's safer to be outside with people. So where we can, still gather outside, I don't know I am following somewhat what's happening in the US with the atrocious numbers of cases that are rising. And the cases are rising here in BC as well, but it's not as bad. And but people are starting to consider locking down for the winter, and but I think, looking back at the history of pandemics and how they've been used to control people, is something, I think it's kind of related to the resilience I spoke to when asked the question about self-care, is that, we can't let the pandemic control us neither. And I think a lot of control is gained by limiting people's ability to gather and be together and to organize. And we obviously, I don't want to make it sound like I'm not being cautious of COVID, because I am, and I think we have to take that seriously. But yeah, I guess just using the tools and finding ways to use the tools of the communications technology to our benefit, and to look at that differently, is something that I can't say that I'm there yet. Like I have a hard time with it, but I am starting to change the way I think about it. And I think for younger people, maybe it's easier because the energy is different. But yeah, I think the land-based healing and learning to think differently about how to use the tools for organizing, and going to the places where there's already big coalitions that have been linked, and really being strategic about what networks we're linking up to, where we can have the most kind of strategic impact. COVID has given me the time to kind of think through that a little bit more, which I think is important. And hopefully, this conversation and what, the fact that I've met you all now, hopefully there can be more linkages made and more capacity built within the movement to build an even stronger coalition for making the changes that we're all talking about. So I don't know if that really answers that question, but those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Dawn. Does anybody else want to speak on that question? Okay.
You know, I'm just going to jump in. One thing that that has really impacted me as I'm kind of hearing everyone talk is how everybody's talking about land. You know, whether you're displaced from land, as a lot of us from Latin America are, or we have our land occupied, like Indigenous people in the lands that we're on, or for Black people in the United States, that they were, you know, stolen from their land and are you know, finding ways to assert autonomy on this land that they were brought to. You know, Kamau talked about the community houses and gardens. Edgar talked about how they're using this kind of position, this strong position that they're in forming a union to go towards things like cooperatives and transforming the system. And Don spoke on you know, the work with, you know, wild salmon and ungulates that has to be done, as well as, you know, relying somewhat on agriculture, which is all tied to the land. So I'm wondering if you guys can kind of talk a little bit about how you each of you and your organizations have kind of built communities on your respective lands, and how that's kind of worked, either logistically or ideologically.
I don't mind jumping in. So the you know, one of the basis of our sort of ideological thinking is based on you know, the ideas of Malcolm X and others, and part of the sort of the Black liberation movement, particularly here in the United States, which is the basis of revolution is land. So even though we're stolen people on stolen land, we consider ourselves part of our struggle is to have some sort of self-determination within the communities that we live in, and some collective ownership of larger pieces of land and territory. That for us, you know, we call it a sort of a liberated territory thinking or idea, obviously not originated by us, but part of, again, of the Black liberation movement history, is that Black people in the United States have a right to self-determination, and to think about that through the lens of controlling land and institutions and resources is also part of our struggle, right? Our struggle is not just a struggle of, as some people would like the outside world to believe, one of integrating into a system which we think is an oppressive system. A lot of us do. A lot of us take the alternative that our struggle is to tear down that system and to help build new, but also within that to develop ideas around self-determination and control of resources. Because we just don't believe that any people should be governed by someone else who has shown themselves not to have the best interests of those folks, right? And so that's the ideological perspective for us is key in how we do our organizing, where we do our organizing, and even our attempts. We have campaigns that are called like Buy Back the Block. Not only do we own sort of a community house, we control a community garden that's right next door to us. We own another land plot that's right across the street, and are continually looking for ways to purchase more property and more land, because we think that is key for us to have sort of an inside-outside fight, right? To be able to build alternative outside institutions as we challenge those institutions that our tax dollars go to. So on that level, it's sort of even more so than on a practical level, an ideological level for us, land is key in how we think about the work that we have to do as a political organization.
I'd like to chime in on this one as well. So for Indigenous peoples in so-called Canada and BC, well, I'll speak about BC. There's 27 nations of Indigenous peoples who have never surrendered or ceded our title to the land. The provincial government here is pushing what they call a modern day BC treaty process, but really it's just an economic formula doomed for failure. Indigenous nations need to go into huge debt and years of negotiating to settle a treaty at which at the end they don't even end up with Aboriginal title and rights. They end up with fee simple tenure, which is very different from Aboriginal title and rights. There's been very few cases where Indigenous peoples actually have veto decision-making power over the activities that happen on our land. The system very clearly favors the top 1%, mostly white males of the corporate control of the food system who enjoy the highest level of comfort and ability to consolidate huge tracts of land and water and infrastructure to do farming and to do resource extraction projects. And so in the meantime, Indigenous peoples are forced under duress to fight in a legal system, an imperialistic legal system that makes decisions based on the balance of convenience, balancing out who is inconvenienced the most and how they measure that to determine court rulings. So of course, their only measure of convenience is the resource extraction economy. There is no measure of Indigenous food and cultural values and health and well-being and the risks associated with some of these developments that relate and how they impact our health and our food. And so when we think of land and the systemic, the racism and the way that white supremacist narrative and white males, the top 1%, are favored in the system of land consolidation. We've been looking at really trying to decolonize that and name that, and really we've developed a decolonizing food system cross-cultural interface framework. That is a framework and a tool. It provides terminology and structure to create culturally safe spaces where often Indigenous peoples are holding the tension and carry the burden of holding the tension of having these very contentious conversations around land. And as I say, forced under duress to work in a system of decision making that doesn't reflect or measure our values. So this decolonizing framework has it's got exciting potential for reconceptualizing a different way of mapping out and advocating for the protection, conservation, and restoration of Indigenous food lands, because there is no system or framework for decision making or policy that actually enables that will position that, or that will even make us visible. So, you know, in Canada, various levels of government have proclaimed truth and reconciliation, but we know as Indigenous peoples that we cannot reconcile within the same framework. So when it comes to land, you know, we have to fight for every last little square inch, because right now there are huge corporations traveling around the world, right in my home territory, buying up all the last tracts of land. And like I say, huge infrastructure for irrigation and water that are impacting our biodiversity and our Indigenous food systems. So I think, you know, to really be deep and meaningful and strategic around land, land back, hashtag land back, I think we need a new framework, and we're working on that. So yeah, that's kind of what I'll say about that for now.
Thank you very, very much, Dawn. When you were speaking about, you know, land and the struggles, you know, I was thinking about the TMX pipeline, right? The expansion that's actually going through Suquamish territory. And I know people are protesting now. Some people are getting arrested and all this stuff like that. So And we know that when there is pipelines and construction sites, there is an increase in violence against missing and murdered Indigenous women. So how do we build like communities of resistance that empower and, you know, respond to these issues where you're saying that, you know, Suquamish people and Mapulaps people have never signed a treaty, and they have never ceded their lands, it's unceded, and yet still there is a denial to the hereditary chiefs on what they are saying and what the grassroots people are saying, the grassroots hunters and fishers, fishermen and gatherers and stuff like that. So how do we build that community of resistance, us as allies and Indigenous people, and support even now?
Well, that's a really big question, and it is happening. I think we start with realizing how it actually is happening, but realizing ourselves more fully in that, because I often get really inspired, and I know there's still a lot more work to do. As we organize on the ground and build a stronger movement, and you know, as people of all colors become more courageous and come to the front lines with us, some of the, you know, the women who are on the front lines trying to stop TMX in my home territory with the Tiny House Warriors, and with some of my other relatives down in Kamloops who are organizing another action this weekend at a location where TMX is threatening to start drilling under the Thompson River. You know, we are, again, we're on the front lines, and we need people to show up to that. And because while we do that, there are white supremacists that are countering. There's been conflicts that have happened on the TMX pipeline where the Tiny House Warriors have been holding it down for I think probably well over a year, maybe even close to a year and a half, up in Blue River. And yeah, so there is some real, as the white supremacy kind of comes to the surface, I think when we do this kind of work and name injustices like, you know, the systemic injustices around the resource extraction, and for us as Suquamish, our identity is, our name actually translates to the people of the land where the water flows from the highest mountains through the rivers on its way to the ocean. So our name and our identity is so intimately intertwined with that water that our women, we can't stop ourselves when we take it very seriously, our role as stewards of the river and the water. And so the question around how to organize is a really big question because we're doing it with very little. We need a lot of support. We need a lot of financial, technical, and human support. But I think in doing that and calling people of all colors to the front lines with us is, I guess, before people show up to do their work on themselves. And especially, you know, we like to think that, and we do have a lot of like white settler friends and allies who are showing up to support and to kind of unpack their own privilege and their own fragility in this work. And that's really beautiful. And then there are others who show up and haven't quite done their work yet, and that can be really challenging work on the front lines when it's you know, when we're trying to do so much with so little. So I guess it's just thinking about organizing and how every individual can do the work for themselves, I think that goes full circle to one of the first questions that was asked earlier about self-care, and really coming to this work in support of Indigenous peoples to stop TMX, to stop Imperial Metals, Mount Poly mine from continuing to spill toxic sludge into the Fraser River, to stop the fish farms in the Broughton Archipelago that are infesting our wild salmon with sea lice and threatening them with the European retrovirus. To stop the deforestation, the large-scale logging that is having a huge impact on our climate, to stop the industrial agriculture from continuing to release huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere through the soil, through cattle, and through really unsustainable practices. These are all, in addition to TMX, there's there's multiple kind of, there's multiple impacts that are happening that if a person can choose one that inspires them the most and do their work and come along and work with us. And I'm really inspired by some of the different white settlers who are doing their work and kind of caucusing on their own to kind of really look deeply into what that kind of organizing looks like for themselves. So that's what comes to my mind when you ask that question. And of course, it's a huge question, but thank you for asking.
Thank you so much. And indeed, we will show up. I'm coming. So we have a question. We have a question here. It says, what are some ways to make your organizing sustainable? How do we maintain momentum and participation? I think that's for anyone. So anyone who would like to speak on that? I kind of want to hear Kamau, you say on how do we maintain momentum and participation, and specifically why I'm also interested in picking on you is just because of how, you know, brutalized we as Black people, Black women, Black men feel too on, you know, Breonna Taylor and George. You know, we're traumatized, we're not healing, and we still have to keep pushing. And there's COVID, and we still have to keep pushing. So how do we do that? How do we still keep that momentum when we're like, and we're expected to go to work? Some people, you know, put on this different face of whatever, nothing's happening in the background, you know? So.
I mean, right now, I would actually say that there's a lot of momentum, relatively speaking, for folks to push back against, at the very least, police violence, what they see as sort of a proto-fascism through Donald Trump. So the question for me is less about because I think what the state does in these moments is it in some ways, it does a couple of things. It tries to change the narrative, right? It starts to focus in what it considers to be protests that are go too far, and to make people feel defensive about the actions of protesters. It starts to separate protesters into good protesters and bad protesters. It starts to show these small symbolic victories, i.e. for the United States, which I'm not saying are not somewhat important, but they are symbolic no matter what anybody says. It's like sort of the taking down of Confederate statues or flags. And then at its most pushed, what it does is it attempts to have minimal legislative changes and or speeches by politicians, which are supposed to make us believe that these problems are now being addressed. And so therefore, we need to either go back and get out the streets or just solve our problems through the ballot box. And so I think these things are momentum shifters for how our struggle takes place. And again, I think unfortunately to a degree, because a lot of our struggle now is based in this nonprofit system, some of the nonprofits themselves, whether knowingly, unwittingly, participated in it ourselves as the saying, cheerleader, look what we've accomplished, and making people feel like something large has happened in terms of a shift, as opposed to something, again, symbolic, small, or meant to get people off the streets. So I think for me, the challenge is without deflating some of the ways in which people have sought to sort of cheer on some victories, how do we use the energy that we have and turn it into something longer term and productive that continues to challenge folks to be out in the streets. Again, I think United States history around street organizing, particularly over the last post-World War II, is not one, except for a couple of uprisings, that has been as sustained as, let's say, either Canada, Europeans, or others who will be in the streets for months, literally, without being sort of worn out. And I think that's not the same practice that we have here. So how do we keep street protests going? But also, again, how do we get people involved in the mundane work of what organizing is, the mundane day-to-day, the door knocking that happens for organizing, the planning out of programmatic work, the unfortunate but necessary meetings that need to take place to get things done. How do we make that something that's at times fun, enduring, people can see the purpose of it? How do we make work in some ways something that people can see these models of resistance that give them confidence that their work is bearing fruit? Again, one of the other things in the United States, I would say in particular, is that rhetorically speaking, people are tired. Everybody likes to hear a good speech, but we've heard some of the best speeches we have. We've had some of our best speech makers, 20, 30, 40 years ago. People are still filled with the rhetoric, but not with what do these alternatives look like? How do we make people believe that we can create these different societies and or challenge the society that we have if we can't begin to build the alternative vision so that they can at very least start to see what that new living conditions can look like? And I think that's incumbent upon the radicals, the organizers, the activists. It's not the fault of the layperson or the person who's just getting out there if they don't see it and they lose hope. The fault lies with those of us who've been in the game long enough that we need to be building these alternative structures that people can see as these models of like, oh, at least I can see now what, sort of a catchphrase of what a new world can look like. What is it that we want to build outside of capitalism structures? What is it that we want to build outside of top-down structures that are more autonomous, that take in people's votes and ideas? How do we build those mechanisms within the structures of our organizational apparatuses? So I think for me, those are the challenges of how we stop people from running out of gas. We get them involved. We make them understand that social media is important, but social media is not the life's blood of organizing. How do we do that and get people to sort of commit themselves to that day-to-day activism and organizing, to where they can see the sort of fruit of their efforts and are not just left wanting, and like you said, get tired at the end of the day and go back to work, having to deal with family, and then doing a daily tweet, and they think that's activism for them.
Wow, that was so powerful. That was so powerful. And I think, one of the biggest things, you're talking about models. And I think one of the things that us youth sometimes do is we think we have to recreate something when our elders have models that we just need to know about, right? So the flowing of knowledge sometimes is severed, either purposefully or just because, right? And so that was amazing. Yeah. I just wanted to ask you, Edgar, on the same question of what are some ways to make your organizing sustainable? How do you maintain momentum and participation?
Um, uh, One of the some thoughts that had just popped up to the prior question about land. I'll get to the second question as well. Um, something to think about, even here in the U.S. There's in the next 20 years, there's going to be over 200 million acres of land that are just going to be up because of people aging out or selling or whatever. Um, and I think that it was when Don was talking, that was something that popped up in my mind, that like who is going to have access or the ability to be on this land, this 200 acres of agricultural, for the most part, land. Is it going to be like a democratic community process to see who determines to get that land, or would it just be more and more just capitalists buying up the land and just doing whatever they want with it? So I see that as a kind of like a movement opportunity, and to organize to see how communities can get into that picture of land and protecting or practicing other types of agriculture. Um, um, so that was just something that popped into my mind. Um, we view the union, even with the prior organization that I was with, the community, we see that like agroecology as the way to for us to practice our way of farming, which also comes with, it has all the principles of sustainable, organic, non-exploitative, and building towards food sovereignty. But also comes with like a class consciousness and knowing our position, our political position and direction. And I think, to the second point about how do we build momentum, in the case of farm workers, from the context that we're at, because of just how beaten down we've been, even the many attempts of organizing within immigrant workers, just the retaliation and the force that comes at workers from the industry and from rich people, really has us feeling down. And really, it's really hard to build up that momentum again. But when there's a spark, we need to fan that spark so it can become into a flame of powerful people organizing against the system. So in our context, we need to see, our people want to see a win. And that's just the reality. Like, it could be a small win or some kind of win. But we need to really portray that to their people, that we, despite all the odds and the history that's been against us, that there are moments that we can take that opportunity and, to, what is it? Bobby Seale, I think, said, we need to seize the time to capture that moment and really build off it. And with the hope, at least from our part, that if we're able to win at one place, that'll create a ripple effect and people will start believing and seeing those conditions that they're living in or working in, that they could be changed through organization and confronting rich people and the traditional power. So I think that's, in a way, how we build momentum, or try to build momentum, by finding those opportunities, and instead of saying that it's impossible to win, or like that's not the way, or whatever, to really see what happens and see the possibilities. We need to keep experimenting and trying out new ways of organizing, or else we're just going to be stuck. Even at this moment with coronavirus, where it's evident that nobody really cares about poor people, that if we're not taking the advantage of right now, where there's record strikes, and we're talking about the labor movement, there's record strikes and all these labor organizing and opportunities. If we're not right now organize and taking advantage of those for some wins, then it's going to be more difficult down the line.
Yes, this is a very crucial time that we are in, and it's somewhat sad that all these brilliant minds are just being used to just demonstrate that we are humans and that we deserve these rights, which is frustrating, you know. I think when you're talking about momentum, and I'm seeing everybody's different struggles, let's say, obstacles, coming together in solidarity is one of the biggest ways I think that a foundation cannot be broken, because of there's so many different moving parts. I know you're working with Black youth and you're working in urban communities, which is a different landscape than if you were in, in open land and space. So when you're in urban and you're on concrete, and let's say if you're in the ghettos or wherever, your mindset is kind of different and all that stuff. Is there a way, with you working with Black youth, and I know that the farm workers, there's children, is there a way to, and even Indigenous people as well, is there a way to coalesce these movements in a way where there is attention brought to all sides, you know? So even the Black youth, they become really aware of the struggles that farm workers are going through, and their children, and farm workers are supporting Black youth. And then there's the understanding of how Indigenous people are also there. Is that, how does that look like? How can we all support one another and also educate our youth?
Again, I don't mind starting. I think it's some young folks call it intersectionality. Old heads like me call it solidarity work, right? That's part of the struggle. The part of the struggle has always been, what do we have in common that can bring us together to fight against what we see as injustice? And again, I think the obvious thing is that we all live under an elite white supremacist capitalist system, right? That is trying to, whether it's purposefully doing it or not, that is destroying the planet, right? That is hoarding wealth and resources, that is allowing our children to be miseducated and forcing our children into working conditions which are not to their long-term benefit, that is stripping the wealth of Indigenous people, of Indigenous lands, that practically uses slave labor in all parts of the world and gathers those resources again for elite, with elite needs and elite concerns, and holds it together through a militarized force. There's a European system, and that system has its folks who work for it, in terms of other folks of color and other nation states, but they're working under the guidance of a European system of Western capitalism, or what some people now are calling a lot of racial capitalism, that looks to use our folks. If that's not a reason for solidarity and working together, I don't know what is, right? And I say the differences of where we live and how we live are minor compared to what we have in common around fighting that injustice. And so for me, that's always a lead way to working with folks, and again, bringing together people around the issue, or working around the issue of the solidarity that we have. I've been lucky enough to travel to Cuba, to Palestine, to other places to build and to learn about folks' struggles and what they have in common with the struggle we have here. Here being those of us who live what I would call obviously the centerpiece empire, that still helps to direct how resources are misused. So I think for me, that's a powerful incentive to understand that the differences that we have are never acute enough for us not to be able to see the common enemy that's destroying the planet and will take us all down if we don't find ways to build solidarity, not only with young people, but of course, organizations and of course, peoples who need to work together because only in that way will we be able to battle people who have more resources and, to be honest, access to more weaponry than we probably ever will have.
Thank you very, very much. It's heavy, but it's good. It's reinvigorating, honestly, to hear you say that. Just because of, I know that there's a lot of young people feeling the same way about banding together and moving beyond. Even with COVID, people are still like, the youth, my people here are still like, how can we support? How can we get together? I know we're running out of time, but I just had one more question for you, Kamau. You were talking about you were talking about community housing. That's a very personal interest for me, especially living here in Kilauna, Kelowna, Sea territory, Ancida Sea territory, where we create spaces for Black and Indigenous people, you know, to actually dream. We have the right to dream and to achieve our dreams and not just be afraid to dream because of security and stuff like that. So we are playing with the idea of what it looks like to have a village, right? And community and support, and supporting artists as well who are saying something, who are telling their stories. So how are you doing that?
We were lucky enough to, again, we have the community house, and what we do here in Atlanta and in Detroit, and what we do is to use that like as a focal point to bring folks together. So our urban gardener who runs our food sustainability work lives in the house. We have other organizations that rent space out to do their community work out of. And obviously we open up the space for events, for other community-based meetings, for our programmatic work. And, you know, when I was a young organizer, again, it's one of the things that we really lack a lot of times is the resources that we control and own to do exactly you're talking about. How do we plan and how do we build without having spaces that we control, right? Without having to worry about what our political message is because someone's going to throw us out, right? How do we start to do that? And that for us becomes primary in terms of thinking about that village. And that allows us to be part of the neighborhood that we live in, that we do our work out of, is Southwest Atlanta, which is one of the last working class Black neighborhoods in Atlanta, which was founded in 1883 by formerly enslaved Africans, in particular what's called Pittsburgh in Atlanta, not Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but in Atlanta. And the history of that neighborhood is something that we feel needs to be preserved and highlighted. And the ways in which we get to do that is that it's a walkable community. So we get to walk to people's houses, talk to them. Again, we do safety patrols in which we try to help support folks if there's any violence taking place. We're watching the police in terms of a cop watch. Folks are involved and working in the community garden that we have. We distribute food to people in the neighborhood. Again, we do the mutual aid work. All of that helps us build this idea of a village, while at the same time, we're having conversations with people around the political nature of the work so that it's not just seen as either service work or something that we're doing in some feel-good organization, but instead it's seen as, like you're saying, perfect analysis is, how do we build a village that allows us to together begin to sort of fight back against the oppressive forces, right? And that's only going to happen through a mutual political thinking. Doesn't have to be exact, but a political thinking around who are the forces that are stopping us from acquiring communal wealth. who are the forces that are stopping us from protecting our communities against violence, not only within, but from without our communities, right? The police are no solution to violence in our communities. Only us as a community can do that. So that's how we use the house as that centerpiece that allows us to go out into the larger community to work and struggle. You know, we don't have lots of resources and large tracts of land to do that out of, but what we do have allows us to begin to build that process. It allows us to say that 40% of the membership of community movement builders lives in the very neighborhood that we are organizing out of, right? And so I don't believe that's a prerequisite for doing work, because I believe our struggle is both national and international. But I believe it does give you a basis for talking to people about their common concerns within a common community.
Thank you so much for everybody. I'm just mindful of time and seeing as we're kind of closing into 7 o'clock. I want to thank each of our panelists as well as our moderator, Dia, for a really great discussion. I think that we could go longer if we all had the energy to, and we could keep discussing these things for a long time. But I'm really thankful. When I reached out to each one of you, it was an immediate response of yes, let's do this, and I'm so appreciative. So I hope that we'll continue in contact, and we could have a similar panel in the new year. I'm gonna pass it over to the panelists, and then Dia, if you have any closing statements you'd like to finish off with, and whichever order you'd like. Thank you so much.
I think we should start with the panelists, please. So whoever wants to go first.
I'll just say thank you for having me, and it was a pleasure meeting you, Kamau and Edgar and Mandia and Luis. I look forward to meeting you someday in Kelowna. I've have a history there. I was born in Vernon, and a well-known Sioux woman, Jeanette Armstrong, was one of my biggest mentors and helped us ignite the Indigenous food sovereignty movement back in 2006. So I also have family living there, and my family, after my mom and my aunts and uncles got out of Indian residential school, they went back to our reserve and our land was taken. And so they went to the Okanagan to pick fruit back in the day. And at that time, I was just a baby, and they were spraying DDT and all kinds of harmful chemicals in the orchard industry. And my family still has some symptoms. One of my uncles still has some symptoms of the persistence of the DDT in his system. So when I hear the plights of farm migrant workers, I think of my own family and how they've been exploited in that industry. And that's never been brought to justice. And I think it's, when I get asked sometimes what brought me to this work, I think, wow, when I go back even to how I was brought into the world, it kind of, in many ways, I think, started then with back when I was a baby. The government tried to take me from my mom because we're Indigenous, and they were what they call the 60s scoop. They were taking a lot of children and continuing to put them in residential school. And my mom wouldn't let them take me. But the reason that they said that they wanted to take me was because she didn't have enough food to feed me. So all of this I've learned over the years. I'm like, wow, I guess that's why I'm so deeply motivated to do this work, and in ways I'm only still coming to realize. So thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit of that with you all, and we're all connected. So thank you.
I'll quickly go so that Edgar can have the last word. I want to thank everybody also for allowing me to be on the panel. And it's, I think it's actually been a while that I've spoken with folks from sort of in an international realm on a panel discussion. So I'm appreciative of that, just to hear about the great work that's happening and the diversity of the work. And I'm, as always, honored and pleased to be involved in this type of organizing. So I am deeply appreciative of the opportunity to speak to this audience. And I agree. I think, you know, the work is here for us. The solidarity is something that we have to figure out how to do together, how to make it real, how to make it useful for all of us. And I think as long as we do that and respect our individual struggles, that eventually we will win and we will save this planet from those who would choose to abuse it for their own privileges. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm really thankful for participating in this and hearing from the work from Kamau and Don. And, you know, from us, somewhat a new union, we wouldn't have been here without a lot of support from people from all over. And we always want to keep that in mind and participate or help in any way. So if there's anything ever you need in your areas, just let us know and we'll try to contribute as much as we can. Because we believe in that solidarity work and giving back as much as we can. So yeah, and then thanks to RAMA from organizing, and hopefully once the borders get back open, we can go and head out to Kelowna and visit y'all. I know it's been something that we've been talking about for a long time, you know, or we can just, you know, our people are good at crossing borders, so we can go anyways.
We'd love to have you come visit our Indigenous Food and Freedom School in Chase.
For reals, yeah. I mean, we'll be willing to go anywhere and to learn and contribute any way we can. So thank you all.
Thank you so much to all you amazing panelists for the roots that you have, the trees that are growing. You don't know how you've inspired me to keep going. Rama, thank you so much for bringing these amazing people together. I was reading up on them. I was like, oh my God, you know, just the work, you know, I've committed my life. I'm young. I have one gray hair, so I don't know. But, you know, I've committed my life. This is what my family and I are doing. So you guys just know that what you're doing is going to the youth, and we're taking up that mantle too. And it's going to change. It's going to change. We feel it in the air, you know? So thank you, Rama. Thank you, everyone. Nitumezi ahulu, as I say in my Zambian language.
On that note, thank you very much again, and we'll be in contact with everyone through social media, through email, and yes, thank you very much.
Bye. Adios.
Bye. Kiona.